Hello, I'm Joanne Diaz.
And I'm Abram Van Ingen.
And this is Poetry for All.
And today we have a very special guest, my colleague, Professor Stephanie Kirk from Romance Languages at Washington University in St. Louis. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you. I'm so delighted to be here.
Stephanie is an expert in many things, including the remarkable poet Sor Juana, who is a fantastic, enormously important poet from the 17th century in New Spain. One of the things I wanted to mention about how this particular episode came about is that Stephanie and I are actually teaching a grad seminar together around Anne Bradstreet and Sor Juana. So I just wanted to paint some context for you because this is kind of remarkable. You have these two women poets who are both religious in heavily religious contexts, Puritan New England, Catholic New Spain, both living at the same time, both praised as the 10th muse risen from America, both publishing their work actually in Europe, both from elite inner circles, both with long-lasting legacies, and each interpreted very differently by those who came afterwards. So we designed a whole seminar around it. It was super fun.
It was super fun.
So I'm wondering, Stephanie, could you just kick us off by reading Sor Juana's Sonnet 189, first in Spanish and then in English?
I'd be happy to. Here goes the Spanish version. Mueran contigo, Laura, pues moriste, los afectos que en vano te desean, los ojos a quien privas de que vean la hermosa luz que a un tiempo concediste. Muera mi lira infausta en que influiste, ecos que lamentables te vocean, y hasta estos rasgos mal formados sean lágrimas negras de mi pluma triste. Muévase a compasión la misma muerte que precisa no pudo perdonarte, y lamente el amor su amarga suerte. Pues si antes, ambicioso de gozarte, deseó tener ojos para verte, ya le sirvieran solo de llorarte.
Awesome.
And now the English version, in a translation by Edith Grossman. Because you have died, Laura, let affections die too that yearn, desiring you in vain, along with those eyes you deprive of the sight of the beautiful light you once bestowed. And let my forlorn lyre die, where you inspired echoes that mournfully cry out for you, and that even those ill-favored strokes become the black tears of my melancholy pen. Then let death herself be moved to take pity, who was compelled and could not pardon you, and let love lament his own bitter fate. For if at one time he longed to enjoy you, and wished to have eyes so that he could see you, now they will serve him only to weep for you.
That's great. Thank you so much. Maybe to get us started, instead of jumping right into the poem, we should just talk a little bit about who Sor Juana was and when she lived and wrote. So who was Sor Juana?
Sor Juana was a Creole born of a Spanish father and a Spanish descendant mother. So Creole is the idea of people who were born in Mexico of Spanish descent. It was actually a term first used to talk about people of African descent and then co-opted by those of European descent. She was born in a place called San Miguel La Pantla, just outside of Mexico City, and she was born either 1648 or 1651. There is rather a dearth of information about her life. But yes, she was born in this small village south of Mexico City. During her teens, was sent to live in Mexico City with relatives, and then eventually, when she was about 16, moved to be a lady-in-waiting at the viceregal court in Mexico City.
So she's in court and headed toward one kind of life.
Right.
What happens to her at that point?
Yeah, it's interesting. So because she was always, even from a young age, renowned for being prodigiously intelligent, she became to the notice of a lot of different people, both secular and religious. And one of these was the confessor of the viceroys, this man called Antonio Núñez de Miranda, who was a very sort of prominent Jesuit. And he became very interested in her because she was so intelligent. And I think it seems that he steered her towards the monastic life, although she herself said at one point that she had a repugnance for matrimony. The idea being that the convent provided a more stable place for intellectual life, although it wasn't a space where intellectual women gathered and lived because the church did not allow that. But she felt that it was more convenient to be a nun, it seems to me, than to be involved in court life or married.
Can I ask a quick question? I'm actually teaching a very short, just mid-term class right now, and it's on the medieval and Renaissance periods. And I've tried to incorporate a handful of songs and poems. Well, mostly songs, actually. I found this wonderful book that features the work of women composers in the medieval and early modern periods. And I think that this coupled with what you're describing, women who lived in convents and wrote poems, wrote plays, I think that this is something that most people don't know a whole lot about. And I wonder if you could talk about Sor Juana's readers. And who she imagined as her audience, how she was received in her own time period.
So she was not this kind of hidden poetic talent in her age. People knew who she was. People read her work. These things were performed in cathedrals. There were plays. So she was not hiding her light under a bushel. But most of her work was published in Spain and Portugal. So she had readers all across the Atlantic. These 3 volumes of her work went through multiple reprintings. And then she did print some stuff in Mexico, and she was read amongst, the elite.
Can I ask, so she has once been described to me as the Shakespeare of Mexico.
I said that.
Yeah. Did you say that? Okay, that was great. So you have described her as the Shakespeare of Mexico. It was once described to me recently in a co-taught seminar. So I am wondering if you could explain that a little bit. And also just, she goes on, right? I mean, like, she's well-read, well-remembered in Mexico. She has a huge reputation. Like, there's a Netflix special out around Sor Juana, and
what?
I don't know, there's television series.
I
and so
will
on,
talk
right?
about the Netflix. It's pretty
tell
bad.
me about,
Is it so bad that it's good? Or is it like Michael Jackson bad? Or is it?
It's the sum. Unfortunately, it's no longer available on Netflix, but it's playing fast and loose with history, let's say that. But let me answer the first part of the question, and then we can talk about some of these contemporary representations, because they really are very, very interesting. So Mexican Shakespeare, I'm sure people would listen to this and cringe, but I say it to students to try and get them to understand that this was a person who was famous in her time, as was Shakespeare. And this is someone who very much fulfills the role of the national poet in Mexico, very much as Shakespeare. I mean, I grew up in England. I was just like force-fed Shakespeare at a very early age. And all I remember reading, and Charles Dickens and Shakespeare. So in the sense that she's incredibly, her memory and legacy remains. So she's on a banknote, right? She's in like the Pantheon of Heroes in Mexico City. There are statues of her. There's a university, the Universidad Claustro de Sor Juana, which is part of it is the convent where she lived. And it's an actual very well-respected university. So she has this immense kind of like sort of valence and power of memory across in Mexico. So Mexican school children can all very much recite one of her poems. There's this very famous poem called Foolish Man. And I think most Mexican school kids can recite that today. There are like children's books about Sor Juana. What's interesting as well is that she's also very much a Latinx heroine. There's murals in parts of LA and Chicago, where there's large Mexican communities. And then there's been a couple of movies. There's a movie by a feminist Argentine director, Maria Luisa Bemberg, and it's called I, the Worst of All, because that's when she had this supposed confession when she renounced all secular and intellectual activities. She wrote this text and signed it in blood, I, the Worst of All. So,
whoa.
And then so both the film and the Netflix soap opera, telenovela, I guess you would call it, position her as this kind of queer heroine whose relationship with the vice-regents was sexual. So, taking the love poetry, which she wrote is, this love poetry to these women. There were 3 of them, and she wrote this poems dedicated to all of them and about all of them. But, contemporary readers, including the people who made the Netflix special, like to take this as an evidence of this kind of queer love.
You mentioned all these women that she wrote to and addressed poems to, and this tradition of reading her as a queer writer from the period because of these poems. We have a poem now before us, and maybe we should sort of move towards that poem, which is addressed to Signora Marquisa de Mancera. Am I saying that right?
Mancera, yeah.
Mancera. So I'm wondering, is this one of the women that it gets associated with that?
So she was the first of the viceroys that Sor Juana was close to. There's three of them, and Leonor Carreto, who was the viceroy when Sor Juana became a lady in waiting, and she was very close. And I think we could say that she was a mentor to Sor Juana as a very young age. She was a noblewoman of Austrian German descent, who moved to the Spanish court when Maria Teresa of Austria was the Queen of Spain, and then married this guy, Marqués de Mancera, whose name I actually don't know. I could think about it, but I know her name. And Sor Juana wrote 4 poems to Leonor Carreto, 4 sonnets, one sonnet in which is about Sor Juana herself recovering from illness and how the viceroy, who she calls Laura, how the viceroy helped her recover, how she kind of stared down death for Sor Juana, and how through her love she was able to recover. And then she wrote 3 sonnets on her death. So it's interesting. So they stop being the vice-regal couple, but they stay on in New Spain for 6 more months. And then as they're leaving, it's very sad. As they're leaving Mexico, she dies on the way, the viceroy. And that's when Sor Juana writes these three sonnets, of which the one that I read is the best. They're all beautiful, but this one is the most beautiful, I would say. So yeah, and then so Laura is the name she gives her. Very Petrarchan, shockingly.
Well, that's really my first question. I think, just correct me if I'm wrong, did you say that the Marquisa de Mancera, her actual name is Leonor Carreto?
Yeah.
Right. So she's referring to her as Laura in this poem. And as you say, I mean, Laura is the object of desire and source of inspiration for Petrarch, of course. So one has to wonder why Sor Juana would choose that name for Leonora.
Yeah. Well, so she had names for all of them that are all part of this kind of courtly love tradition. The second viceroy, to whom she wrote the most intense poems of the ones she wrote to women, she called her Lisi. And then the third one, who I don't think she had such a close relationship, she calls her Elvira. It's interesting, though, because these are not Petrarch's silent beloved. This is, these people are flesh and blood people, right? Who we can historically identify. And these are her patrons. There's this scholar called Lisa Rabin who wrote this beautiful article about Petrarch and Sor Juana's Petrarchan poetics. And one of the things that she says, Lisa Rabin, is that basically these women are not objects of desire. They're objects of political expediency. And there's obviously friendship. I think, there are strong bonds of friendship, but there's also some kind of politics and self-promotion going on here in the way that although it's hard to read this poem and think that she didn't really feel greatly impacted by her death, and there's a great deal of affection in this poem that I think it would be really hard to feign. So I think Lisa Rabin is right in the sense that it's not this distant invoked beloved, but it really is these flesh and blood women with whom she had these sort of patron poet relationships.
I want to get into this poem, and as we do, though, I want to ask you, we sort of said, hey, let's do Sor Juana. Let's do an episode on Sor Juana. She's a super important poet. What poem do you want to do? And you gave us 4 poems to choose from, and this was among them. So I'm just sort of curious about this poem. What stands out to you? I mean, why is this one of the 4 that made the list? What is it about this poem that you love?
Well, I love the affective kind of quality of it that's really powerful. But mainly I like it. I mean, there's many things I like about this poem, but I like it because of the second quatrain. I'm obsessed with it. It's just the most beautiful and enchanting 4 lines that I think I have read. And I like the way she situates herself as a writer, which is kind of not typical in the period. The seeing her in the act of writing when she talks about the black tears of my melancholy pen. And it also, the whole poem, but particularly these 4 lines that I really love, speak to this sort of sensorium of Sor Juana's lyric repertoire, this kind of highly visual nature.
Well, it's interesting. Maybe we could get right into the poem and see how it's working, because as I listen to you talk, I'm looking at the poem on the page, and I could be mistaken, but I think there are only 3 sentences in this 14-line sonnet, right? The first quatrain is its own complete sentence, and then the second is its own, and then that final sestet, as you say, that's one more sentence. So what interested me as I was reading this poem by myself, just, in my head, is there are only a few sentences, but a lot of what I found to be complex clauses that really build upon each other in that way. As you were describing the Baroque, I thought, yeah, there's a lot of leaping here from one clause to the next. So to get to those eyes, it's interesting what you say about how she's obsessed with eyes, right? So in the first stanza, because you have died, Laura, let affections die too that yearn, desiring you in vain. Along with these eyes you deprive of the sight of the beautiful light you once bestowed. Ooh, even as I read that aloud.
It's so good.
Yeah, but the alignment within the lines of that eyes sound, eyes, sight, light, desire, die. That's really interesting in this translation. I love that. Is it right that, my sense is that the poetic speaker wishes to die too. Is that correct?
She wants her affections to die.
The affections to die.
It sort of reminds me of that Ben Jonson poem, right? How does the line go? Let me no more father now?
Yes.
And so there's this sense of the pain of this love leaves me with a yearning not to feel the affections that would lead to this kind of pain again.
I think it's also talking about how her poetic impulse has died as well through this, because the idea let my forlorn lyre die, right? So the lyre being the kind of stand-in for the poet. I see this kind of as a way of saying that her desire to write poetry has gone along with Laura, because Laura was so much the inspiration and the muse behind the poetry that she wrote. And that's, of course, not what happened, in the sense that she went on to write many, 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 many more poems. But it does seem to me that the pervading sense of loss throughout this poem hits on many different levels, in the sense that it hits on the loss of the beloved, but also the loss of poetic inspiration.
Well, and what you're saying fits with the Laura, calling her Laura, right? Because Laura is the muse that inspires Petrarch to write his sonnet. But even as she is writing, she's writing out her desire not to write anymore and saying, let the ink basically be the tears, right? So, and let my forlorn lyre die, where you inspired echoes that mournfully cry out for you. And let even these ill-favored strokes become the black tears of my melancholy pen.
That's the best line, the black tears of my melancholy pen. That's the line I love. I love all of it. And her pen was a very melancholy pen in so many ways. So many of her poems are infused with melancholy. So it just, I think if I were to write another book about Sor Juana, it would be called The Black Tears of My Melancholy Pen, because I love it so much. We'll see if that ever happens.
And I'm interested in how the logic of the poem moves as well. So it begins in stanza 1 with, because you have died, Laura, please let my affections die too. And in addition to my affections, and I will still contend, even if there isn't a death drive in stanza 1, there is a desire for the eyes to be blinded, to be deprived of sight, because with so many sonnets, there is this movement from sight into insight. And it's interesting to me that sight is the very thing that, with the absence of this Laura, there's a wish to never see again, right? That's really interesting. And then stanza 2, and let my forlorn lyre die. So in addition to these eyes being deprived of sight, let my forlorn lyre die. Then the next two stanzas go like this. Then let death herself be moved to take pity, who was compelled and could not pardon you. And let love lament his own bitter fate, for if at one time he longed to enjoy you and wished to have eyes so that he could see you, now they will serve him only to weep for you. Whoa, what a place to land. How do you see those final wishes of this poem working?
I think the final sort of 6 lines was where she moves really away from her personal grief and takes, addresses these twin entities of death and love, which, as I was saying earlier, are so immensely intertwined in many of Sor Juana's poems, but many poetry and art of the period, this kind of vanitas. Even though Laura is still the subject of what is happening to death and love, it allows her to take a sort of larger philosophical make a larger philosophical intervention on the intertwined nature of these things. I mean, the first 8 lines are very much this kind of feeling of dispossession and grief. And, so then there's this turn, and it's not a very big turn. It's definitely not a swerve. It's kind of a gentle moving into this kind of personification of death and love, how they are also impacted, this bigger allegorical impact of the death of Laura.
And then the black tears of my melancholy pen, the end of the sort of 8th line right before the turn, then gets matched by the last line, the 14th line, where even love's eyes serve only to weep.
Uh-huh.
And that's sort of all that's left for love is to weep.
Exactly. That's all that's left for anybody.
Wow. Beautiful.
Whether it's Sor Juana or love itself, right? After the death of Laura, the absence created by the death of Laura.
Well, with all that we've learned about Sor Juana and this poem, would you be willing to read it for us again?
Sure. Mueran contigo, Laura, pues moriste. Los afectos que en vano te desean, los ojos a quien privas de que vean la hermosa luz que a un tiempo concediste. Muera mi lira infausta en que influiste ecos que lamentables te vocean, y hasta estos rasgos mal formados sean lágrimas negras de mi pluma triste. Muévase a compasión la misma muerte que, precisa, no pudo perdonarte, y lamente el amor su amarga suerte. Pues si antes, ambicioso de gozarte, deseó tener ojos para verte, ya le sirvieran solo de llorarte. Because you have died, Laura, let affections die too, that yearn, desiring you in vain, along with those eyes you deprive of the sight of the beautiful light you once bestowed. And let my forlorn lyre die where you inspired echoes that mournfully cry out for you, and that even those ill-favored strokes become the black tears of my melancholy pen. Then let death herself be moved to take pity, who was compelled and could not pardon you, and let love lament his own bitter fate. For if at one time he longed to enjoy you and wished to have eyes so that he could see you, now they will serve him only to weep for you.
That's great. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
For those who want to learn more about Sor Juana Inéz de la Cruz, we recommend, first of all of the works of Stephanie Kirk.
All of them.
All of them. It would be awesome. But there's also this great Norton critical edition of her works with tons of her samples of her poetry in there, and all of these translations by Edith Grossman. So we recommend that to you. We'll put a link in the episode as well.
It's a wonderful volume, I have to say. It's been done by a wonderful scholar called Anna Moore, put it together, and it has great critical essays, as long as the really fantastic notes and these just spectacular translations.
That's wonderful. And we hope too that if you like what you hear today, we hope that you'll subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and please leave a review for us. Please share this podcast with a friend.
And thanks for listening. Thanks for being here, Stephanie.
It's been an absolute pleasure.